Governments shape lives, they shape behavior. Tackling climate change, therefore, is one of the most critical aspects that the governments can do.
Government needs to prioritize climate change because climate change has this unfortunate ability to set back any development or economic gains that a government has already invested in.
Anything over 2.5 degrees warming, there's no such thing as sustainable development anymore because the climate has basically become so erratic that we can't plan for any type of real sustainable development.
One research we have done is figure out the financing gap, but more interestingly, how the gap is likely to be fulfilled. We estimate the needs are around, I think, 5.4 trillion. So that's the basic financing landscape. Huge financing gap. Whatever the estimates are, 2/3 have to come from domestic resources. Within domestic resources, fiscal positions or budget in general of the government is the main area. But as you know, fiscal space is extremely limited.
The world today is going through a lot of changes, geopolitically, then the COVID pandemic, and that has caused a lot of fiscal distress or fiscal constraints for many governments. And so the first challenge that the government always faces is where to get the adequate resources in order to invest in climate action.
It is not that the countries themselves are not investing in climate change in Asia Pacific and across the world. So if you look at some of the tools that countries have applied, the budget tagging or the diagnostics that they've done in the form of CPIRs, you will see that it's a reasonable amount or a percentage of the total expenditure. So varying from 3% to 10-12%.
There are a lot of leakages, a lot of inefficiencies in government spending, a lot of wastage, I would say. Military spending in some countries is still enormous, for instance. Untargeted subsidies are going on. Fossil fuel subsidies being primary example are enormous in some countries. We did estimates of spending efficiencies in education and health sector. And again, 25 to 30% gains can be had by paying attention to those areas. So you can say there are gains on the margin, but still significant enough. The resources can be relieved, they can be channeled.
And it's worth considering the investment signals that are being provided by government policies and actions in terms of the potential for directing resources to identified priorities. Because if the finance flows are rising, then arguably it's possible for governments to be more deliberate in where that financing is rising or where it's going.
For many governments, climate seems like something that isn't immediate. A disaster is. And so you find quicker disbursement for a disaster than there is for thinking about long-term commitments that need to be made to facilitate resilience and adaptation and to reduce emissions.
The disaster risk or disaster risk reduction, it relates to all of the ministries. Because when the disaster hits any country, they affect all of the people or they affect all of the ministries' area. It is very important to coordination of the ministries and also attract all of the ministries on this issue.
If climate change is causing a lot of economic damage and there is increasingly more and more evidence that is available now, climate-induced natural disasters are causing huge economic losses to societies. So from pure economic perspective, for which finance ministers are very keen on paying attention to, they need to address or at least participate in climate change-related activities.
A lot of the messaging around climate finance can be not necessarily negative, but it speaks to the scale of the problem at hand. What makes you optimistic about the climate finance future and how governments, how different actors can address the climate finance gap?
What we're seeing is that governments are willing to make those efforts, and they are willing to also start looking at identifying how much they're spending, what they need to spend on, what's the best use of public funds, and how they can start to leverage additional funds in a much more predictable and sustainable way.
Because of the initiatives by governments and a global kind of coming together of nations to fight climate change, climate finance is going to explode.